Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Monday, July 29th. Also a great pleasure today to be joined by two very distinguished journalists to come on our show. Steve Pappas is the executive editor of the Barre Montpelier Times-Argus and Rutland Herald, and Chris Graff is the former bureau chief of the Montpelier Associated Press Office, and he held that position for many years, a legend within the industry, I might say. He also hosted the Vermont Public Television's Vermont This Week show from 1992 to 2006. And so we are very grateful to have both of these gentlemen with us today. Steve, Chris, thank you for making the time for this conversation today.
Looking forward to it.
Me too.
Well, a lot going on as always. Even though it's summer, we've got an election coming up, the primary election on August 13th, and the general to follow after that in November. We've had some more flooding in the state. We could talk a bit about that, but we also want to talk a little bit about sort of the whole picture of journalism in Vermont, where things are at. I want to get to that as soon as we can, because Steve, you and I were both at a very interesting conference up in Burlington back on June 28th that I think offered a lot of food for thought about where things are at journalistically in Vermont and the nation for that matter. But I thought maybe let's just start on the primary election that's coming up right around the corner in a couple of weeks. I guess Steve, let me start with you. What strikes you about this primary so far? It's a couple of things are interesting. There don't seem to be very many competitive races for some of the state offices. There is one for the lieutenant governor's race and on both the Democrat and Republican side, but and there are, technically speaking, I guess you could say, competitive races in the race for the primary race for governor. But it seems like you know not quite as what not quite as competitive maybe as there might have been
Yeah.
in other years. What's your take on that?
Well, you just described it very aptly. It's a sleepy primary season, and there are a few reasons that we'll talk about, I'm sure. One of the interesting things that has come out of this is that we're seeing, at least in a few of the legislative races, we are seeing folks who are not subscribing to the two-party system, and are independents who in the past have had party affiliation, but they are jumping into races. We've got a couple in Washington County here, that it's hard to know if it's going to have an impact. Independents have until just a few more days to declare essentially. But there are signs around central Vermont of names that we've seen in the past, but people are going to be surprised to learn are they're going to have to write those folks in because they're going somewhat unaffiliated. And it's my understanding that that is happening in other corners of the state. And these are folks who are unhappy with either the incumbents or the folks who are running because they feel like they're not addressing the issues that are important to Vermonters right now, including affordability, including the education tax, including Act 250. There's a handful of things that are kind of still the hot button issues that are being driven by the Democrats and the Progs, the supermajority. And the pushback is a real one. People are pretty concerned with what the state of Vermont politics happens to be right now. The problem is that they're not running, as you say. I mean, they're not running in the conventional sense, but the issues are still there, and it has made covering this primary interesting because had to happen more in the letters to the editor and commentary sections of the paper, at least the Rutland Herald and the Times-Argus, because the stories themselves about any contested races are more or less non-existent. And I'll let Chris kind of speak to the politics of it, but it's a pretty sleepy primary. and which is sad because, as I said, the issues are kind of top of mind.
Yeah, I think that when you look statewide, when you have every incumbent seek reelection, that sort of locks it up. Remember that in Vermont, no incumbent governor has been defeated since 1962. That's a long time. We like our incumbents in Vermont, and it's not just at the office of governor. So when you have, think back 2 years ago, which in this political life seems like about 10 years ago. But 2 years ago, we had open seats for the US Senate and US House. Very, very competitive primaries in that US House race that Becca Balint won. And so we had a large turnout then. We had a lot of activity. This year, we have all incumbents seeking re-election at the statewide level. So not only is it going to be quiet in the primary, it will be quiet through the general in Vermont at the statewide level. Phil Scott is the most popular governor in the nation. Polls keep showing that. The most recent was just a couple of weeks ago. 81% of Vermonters have a favorable view of him. The next governor down is Kentucky's Andy Beshear. He's 67, and he's on the short list for vice president on the Democratic side. So that shows you what that popularity can do. So, in Phil Scott's case, when he was elected in 2016, he won just barely 53%. But his most recent election 2 years ago, he won 71%. So you can see that's why no one was really willing to challenge him this year. And as long as there's no movement in those upper offices, with Bernie Sanders deciding to run for re-election yet again, then it's sort of like everybody stays in place.
Well, what do you think accounts for Phil Scott's really extraordinary popularity? I mean, here's a state that sends someone like Bernie Sanders to the U.S. Senate, and we have a Republican governor like Phil Scott. Now, he is admittedly, I guess, be fair to say, a moderate Republican, kind of the old school. He did not endorse Donald Trump when he ran for president in 2016 or in 2020. What accounts for that incredible level of popularity here in a pretty blue state like Vermont?
Well, one, when he got elected, I think a lot of it was because of his background. He, as Steve knows, in his neighborhood, because Phil's from Barry, he's a race car driver, Thunder Road, well known that way. He was a construction company owner, hands-on guy, sort of known as a common sense politician. So I think that image has held. At the same time, COVID came, the floods of 23 came, and the floods of 24. And no matter what else you think of Phil Scott, he seems to be really good at handling crises. He's had, COVID is probably the greatest crisis the state of Vermont's ever faced, greater than the 27 flood for sure, or Irene. And he was a steady presence. He was there every day. So I think that cemented his image. I do think he's more conservative than most Vermonters, and especially on some issues. But the character issue overwhelms others.
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely known as the caretaker in chief. I mean, he's consoled the state through, several election cycles to the point where not only has he been reelected, but he's been reelected at times where he has not been able to actually push his agenda because he's been so busy being kind of the point person for getting the answers to Vermonters. And that was huge. Keep in mind that during COVID, he didn't even campaign. I mean, he literally, was at the podium every single day, and he didn't need to campaign. He got airtime to the point where, folks running against him were complaining about it, right? Because he was just on TV every single day. And he's a nice guy. I mean, he will look you in the eye and have a conversation with you about what's going on, and you feel like he heard you. and Vermonters appreciate that in their politicians. And I would agree with Chris that he is more conservative than I think a lot of Vermonters give him credit for. But it's some of those big ticket issues that the party wants him to be more conservative on, that he's not going to be, including abortion and guns, and that alone kind of wins him over on the Democratic side, because if you're going to have anything in Vermont that is going to be a good thing, it's somebody who can lean into that and also drive an EV, right? He drives an EV truck, which is a big win for a lot of folks in the state.
I also think that things are coming to a head in Vermont right now on this issue of affordability, with the supermajority in the House and the Senate, the Democratic supermajority. The number of laws that they have passed in the last couple of years that have raised taxes or changed the way education financing was weighted, so people saw large increases in school tax bills, property tax bills, that this plays into Phil Scott's wheelhouse. He has been talking about affordability since he became governor in 2017. But now there is a concern. He vetoes every year record number of bills. So I think this is coming to a head because the governor says, "Hey, I win with this overwhelming majority. I'm the most popular governor in the nation," and the Democrats say, "Hey, we've been elected in large numbers in a supermajority to enact our agenda." So I'm not sure you're going to see, there doesn't seem to be a way out of this. I think things are coming to a head, and we'll just have to see what happens in this coming year.
And I think it's also fair to say that it seems pretty certain that we're not going to see a seismic shift in the legislature this session. I think, there are some questions about kind of what the potential numbers could be in the Senate, but all in all, I think we're going to continue to see at least a majority, if not a supermajority again. And I don't think there's anybody who thinks that Phil Scott is not going to win in November is kidding themselves. All he has to do is just show up, and between now and then, he's going to win.
Yeah, well, I think that question of will the supermajority hold in the legislature is certainly one I'm watching with great interest. That's the real question, because I wonder if this sort of groundswell of concern about affordability, education taxes, and what have you, will at some level begin to resonate in some of the local local House districts and Senate districts. That there will be some concern about that, and if some candidate could successfully run on, hey, wait a minute, we need to get back to affordability and not just be spending money.
I mean, the lawmakers that I have talked to, the ones who are running and the ones who have left office they have all said the same thing, which is that affordability is the biggest issue in the state right now. That they don't know if they're going to be able to afford, they and their families are going to be able to afford to live here if we keep on the same trajectory.
And I think some of it may not be how many Republicans are elected in November. It's more likely to be what kind of Democrats are elected in November. The Chittenden Central Senate District, for instance, is the most progressive Senate district in the state. 3 incumbents, all very progressive. They're being challenged by Stuart Ledbetter, who many of us know is a former journalist. He was actually host of Vermont This Week for many years and an NBC anchor for WPTC. He is proclaiming himself as a more moderate candidate, one who will try harder to work with the governor. So if we see Stuart elected to one of those 3 positions, that's a message. The thing is, it's just going to be 1 or 2 senators, as Steve was talking about, or 1 or 2 House members. I'm not sure we will see a dramatic difference there. So, but it won't necessarily be the number of Republicans. It will be the kind of Democrats. And remember that we have lost, including in your area, Andrew, Dick Sears, we lost Dick Maza, um, two senators who were known for working with Governor Scott, two Democratic senators who were known to trying to bridge the gap, and they're gone. So it'll be interesting. And we've seen tremendous turnover in the state Senate in the last 2 years, more than half.
Senator Kitchell too,
Yes, that's true.
Was very important as well. As somebody who was oversaw appropriations and was a real, budget watcher and really held Governor Scott accountable.
Well, I got a funny feeling we could easily spend our entire time here talking about the primary and some of these issues, but I wonder if we could maybe pivot at this point over to another area we wanted to talk about, which I guess sort of falls under the broad heading of issues and challenges facing journalism in Vermont. As I mentioned a moment ago, Steve, we were both at a conference up in Burlington towards the end of June there, where there was a very welcome announcement about a large amount of money that would become available to help support journalism in the state. But I guess I just wanted to kind of get us started on this one. What was your sense about the conversations that we heard and were part of up there? Did it leave you with a feeling that, well, the industry may be changing and what used to be the case, the way things were 20 or 30 years ago aren't going to come back, but there is a brighter future ahead?
I didn't need the conference to tell me that the industry is changing. I'm seeing it every day. But I was encouraged by the enthusiasm, especially of younger individuals who were part of the Vermont Press Corps at this point, who seem eager to embrace ideas for changing business models and for going after the audiences where they are and not necessarily in traditional print or broadcast, but looking toward podcasting and other ventures that could potentially be revenue generators, but also building audience. And we all know that there's a shift in how people are reading and how they're consuming information. But what I was impressed with out of the conference was that the number of people who were really trying to adapt in meaningful ways that were engaging readership, in particular, print in particular, in fresh ways, and being able to tell their story and being able to tell about the work that they do and the behind the scenes, but also focusing on the issues and kind of the impact of the issues on the various audiences. And that's ultimately the role that we all have been playing for a long time. I feel like as newsrooms downsized, they kind of drifted away from that. And I think that it's great that they are getting back into it. The part of it that continues to be scary for me is that we don't have the population base and the businesses and the broad enough support for a traditional subscriber base and a traditional advertising base. It just isn't there anymore. And if you had a growing population and lots of families coming in and a lot of energy in communities where the state wasn't graying quite as much as it is, we would have more opportunities. And so Vermont is going to continue to be challenged that way. And yes, it's great that there are opportunities of other funding to kind of seed the work that could be done in newsrooms, as you mentioned. But that requires a different kind of thought. It's going to require, a level of the newspaper and even broadcast leadership in the state to be thinking about what coverage is going to be in a different kind of way. And that's scary to those of us who have done it the same way for a long time. That business model worked for a really long time, and a lot of people got really, had robust careers because of it. But now that that's not happening anymore, they're just kind of waiting for it to come back, and it's never going to come back. And so we have to adapt or we're going to die. And you've seen the fallout from that conference already. There are newspapers around the state, newspaper editors who were at that conference who um, took a page from Paula Rowley at 7 Days and started publishing editors' notes and publishers' notes in the papers, talking about the issues of the week and the issues of the things that they are covering and why they're covering. You've seen house ads start to appear in different publications, introducing you to reporters and editors and people who, are frontline folks, and being able to talk about the work that they're doing. 7 Days just had a cover story about kind of the state of journalism, which I will admit right up front, I was a little irritated with, only because it didn't focus on dailies. It focused on other publications and digital, but it didn't really talk about the state of daily journalism. Um, and so to me, there was a blind spot in there, but it may be justified because I'm not sure that the daily newspapers in this state are considered as relevant as they used to be. And that, that article was very much holding up where the pivoting is happening and the ground shifting under us, at least in the dailies. It's hard to distinguish, or it's hard for us to prove to the public we're indispensable and that we can distinguish ourselves from the other media outlets in kind of a meaningful way. So, to me, the gut kick from that 7 Days article is we have to prove our relevance even more and make even greater efforts toward doing that. And with that, I'm going to let Chris speak because he's been observing this for a long time.
So I think that, Steve, when you talk about the demographics facing Vermont, I think it's important to note that Vermont is not alone. There are vibrant areas around this country that are seeing exactly the same thing as the media shifts. 2,900 newspapers have closed since 2005. They say, on average, 2 newspapers close every week in America right now. When I first started in working in broadcast journalism in 1978, there were 44 radio stations in Vermont, most of whom had active local news operations. Some of them, like WDEV in Waterbury, WJOY in Burlington, and WCFR in Springfield, they had 3 news staff, some of whom they'd send up to this cover of the State House, which is just, that's the way it used to be. So when you just think alone of the resources that we have lost in that time period, there was a figure in that 7 Days article that jumped out at me. I've seen it before. I'm not exactly sure what the source is, but it said that in 2000, the newspapers of Vermont had a staff of 1,446. And last year they had 358. Think about that, going from roughly 1,500 to 400 in 20 years. They pointed out in that article that the Burlington Free Press staff, news staff, has gone from 60 to 6. When you think about VT Digger being held up as this model of isn't this great, and this is, look who's covering Vermont, they've got 13 reporters. That's it. So when you think about what we have lost as a state of the eyeballs of journalists who are going to your local selectmen's meeting, who are looking at state government, who are checking to see, what is going on for us that we as people care about, who's watching the legislature. It's such a tremendous loss. I think I live in Montpelier, and so the Times-Argus is my local paper. And I just hunger for the days when the Times-Argus was out there covering every community every day and the legislature. So I could open the paper and I could read about Montpelier, Barre, Plainfield, all in one paper. And now with Steve's limited resources in his Barre paper, we'll get one story a day from a main story from a community. And those are very important stories, but it makes me wonder, what is Steve not able to cover in the course of a day? And the final point about this financing, VD Digger has been held up as the model, and they are running into trouble. What is happening, and we saw, one of the great stories that is being held out, and it was held out in the 7 Days story, was the Waterbury Roundabout. Well, when you read that, it's basically they raised $50,000 last year total. That's what they raised. You can't run a news operation with $50,000. You can't even hire a full-time person. The woman who is running that is basically doing it as a volunteer, and she's working 40 hours a day, not much less a week, just covering all of Waterbury. So we've lost a tremendous amount in the last 10, 15 years.
And communities overall hurt because of that. I mean, as you point out, when we're serving in that role of watchdog and we're presenting what's going on, we don't want news deserts here in Vermont, and we do have them. And the Waterbury Roundabout is a classic example of a community that wants news but won't support it. And they do support it to a certain degree, but not to the level that Lisa Scalodi can actually be able to lift the coverage to something beyond what it is, which is the bare minimum, which is kind of what we're doing, as you point out. I mean, we can only do so much, but so we haven't covered the state and the State House in a really long time, except that we parachute in and kind of come at it from an issue-driven coverage rather than committee coverage or day-to-day coverage. Mm-hmm. That's a different ball of wax, a different kind of coverage, and it feels, while we're focusing on impact, it doesn't feel like it's great coverage. Same goes for community news. I mean, we get a half page to full page listings of what would have been stories in in the good old days, but now it's a series of briefs that are pulled together by a news clerk. We're still getting it out there, but it's in the most minimal form without any context, and that's hard. We're very grateful to the loyal readers we have, and we haven't seen that kind of drip slow death decline in circulation that a lot of papers have, which it speaks to the community of newspaper readers here in Central Vermont, and we appreciate that. Same for the Rutland Herald, actually. But those newspaper readers, we have a heavy day of obituaries, and I cringe because that was a bunch of my subscribers, and they're not going to be reading anymore. And I don't know who exactly is going to be picking up the paper after them. And those, the challenges are real ones. And I'm glad that I'm getting toward the end of my career and thinking about all this. But what I really want are young people gunning for my job. Just what I really want. I want people eager to do this work and eager to kind of wrestle these bulls down to the ground, because it won't be. I've seen a huge shift in one generation, my generation. The next generation will be even more dramatic. The most frequent question I get is, how much longer are you going to be able to print, or how long do you think the papers are going to be around? Is essentially the question I get, and I don't have an answer.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that it's not just the energy of the staff. If there were a way right now for you to make money as the Times Argus and Rutland Herald, you would. The whole old model of the classifieds, the advertiser-based, is just disappeared. And so you have lost your ability to make the money that you used to be able to make to finance the journalism. You have good reporters and you've got folks out there. You just need more of them. And so far, nobody's figured out the model. The exception to that, Andrew, I'm not sure. I don't understand how well they're doing, but I'll just point out, I think in your neighborhood, in your old newspaper, I think Brattleboro, Bennington, and Manchester are actually doing okay. I'm not sure how they're pulling it off.
I'm not either.
But they seem to be, showing signs of growth.
Yeah.
You put that against the story that was in the 7 Days. The Addison Independent, 77-year-old newspaper in Middlebury, weekly newspaper, now twice weekly, It wins awards every year as the best newspaper, best weekly newspaper, and things like that. And Angelo Lynn is, just this great editor. And he came to the realization that he was losing a ton of money over this last winter. So it's not just a question of content. It's trying to figure out how to monetize that content.
And the other thing that I find myself thinking a lot about is when newspapers either shrink or fold or go away or whatever. That's the open door into, I think, communities that don't have a common way of communicating or talking to each other, and I think it is a real factor driving the whole polarization that we're seeing. Maybe not so much here in Vermont, but I guess you could say that is here, but certainly across the country, where these news deserts are formed, and people have no longer a way to to kind of talk to each other through the paper. Then you see the the social media,
Right.
for lack of a better term, gaining a much bigger foothold in that conversation.
Yes, I think that, when all three of us were younger, there was one truth. There was one set of facts, and we'd look to people like Walter Cronkite to give us that, and then we would, form our own opinions. We now, as a country, can't even agree on the set of facts because of how everything is splintered through social media. There is no, credible voice. Everyone is either watching MSNBC or Fox News. So we've lost that sort of core of knowing and agreeing upon what the facts are on any issue.
Well, again, we could probably carry on this one for quite a while. There's so much to talk about here between where the future does goes, but I guess we're going to have to leave it there for today, gentlemen. But again, I just wanted to thank you both very much for making the time for this conversation. Really appreciate you both. Steve Pappas, executive editor of the Barre Montpelier Times-Argus, and Chris Graff, the former bureau chief of the Montpelier Associated Press Office. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Well, maybe there'll be a conference next year that we can go to, Steve, that will kind of lighten the load.
Maybe we'll see.
We'll see.
Okay.
Well, anyway, and thanks to all of you who've been with us today. Hope you found the program interesting. We'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, take care.